Guys, it's Rachel. It is Thankful Thursday, and I am here this week, and I am running a program which actually Tracy came up with for this week, and we are basically going to look at the health behaviour model for change, which is basically a program of working through a model, and one that is going to take us about 6 weeks. The first week we're going to look at pre-contemplation, second week contemplation, third week active change, fourth week maintenance, fifth week relapsing, and the sixth week we're going to review the model. I'm not overly familiar with the model myself. I haven't actually studied it, obviously I'm aware of those different changes within recovery, but it isn't actually something I've studied myself. So you'll maybe have to bear with me if some of my explanations aren't as great as some of the other girls. So yeah, this week we're going to look at pre-contemplation, and that basically is what is in the word. It's the stage before we kind of contemplate recovery, and it's the stage in which we all go through when we've been ill, whereby we're in denial. There's others who are concerned about us, our behaviours, our health, the impact it's having on us personally, and on a greater basis in terms of family and friends. The stage where people are talking at us, but you know, and we're kind of trying to listen, but we're just not hearing what they're saying. We're also at a point whereby, because of the denial, we actually believe that the behaviours are helping us, and that they're helpful, they're important, they're actually giving us life as opposed to taking away life. And it's also a stage at which perhaps that whole brainwashing nature of an eating disorder and the kind of lies and manipulation that it kind of gives us, that can stop us from moving forward. A number of people enter, in my opinion, enter treatment at this pre-contemplation stage. Not everybody. Quite a lot of people, when they personally are asking for help, I would say are at the contemplation stage, whereby, you know, they're not quite sure. There's kind of like a double nature. There's like the paradox that you're aware that it's killing you, but you're also aware of how it's keeping you alive, if in fact that's even a reality, really. So at pre-contemplation, I would say that it's at the point that others are concerned about your behaviour. And I guess the easiest way for me to do this, if I'm going to do a kind of explanation, is to think about my own processes of healing. So pre-contemplation for me was, I remember my parents going away for a 3-week holiday and coming back, and they were able to see even more the deterioration in my weight. So I had an awful amount of concern from my family, because they'd been away for that period of time. They'd come back and I deteriorated even further. So those concerns were there, friends were noticing, and because the anorexia for me was very, very rapid, it was something that was picked on almost immediately and very, very quickly. Okay, so that was kind of that stage whereby people were coming up to me and saying, Rach, you know, what the hell's going on? Okay, at that point I didn't know what was going on, okay, and my head was becoming so consumed with the eating disorder that even when people were talking to me, it just wasn't there. I couldn't connect myself to the person they were talking about, okay. So I guess there was a degree of denial. Now, I think denial doesn't necessarily have to be a conscious thing, like you're choosing to be in denial, but at that point I had so little insight into what was happening to me. Yeah, I could go onto the internet and put in anorexia, you know, because that's what people were telling me that I was struggling with, but the reality is that I didn't understand the disease, and I didn't know very much about the disease. So I had people talking to me and telling me about it, printing things off and saying, this is what you've got, and me sort of saying, I just could not connect the person they were saying had this problem to who I was. Okay, so at that point, it wasn't that I was purposely refusing to listen, it was that I couldn't connect myself to that person. For me at that point, the eating disorder was so consuming that there was no room in my head for anything else. Okay, so all I could think about was when people were going to try and feed me. When could I get out of it? How could I get out of it? What could I do? Could I feign illness? Could I pretend that I've got a migraine and stay in bed all day just so I didn't have to face eating? What excuses could I make to get out of going out with friends? And all of this type of stuff. So I was brainwashed by the disorder to lie and to be manipulative. And there wasn't, the word I am going to use again is insight. And what quite often happens when a person goes into treatment for the first time, and I was kind of told this, was that I have little, if any, insight into my own illness. Okay, so I wasn't realising at that point what my illness was doing. Now what happens at later stages when people have kind of accepted that they've got an eating disorder, but then they go into denial of it in almost a conscious way, that they choose to just put it there and say yep, well, whatever, and you do have insight into what you're doing to yourself, but you're choosing to ignore it because you don't want to have to deal with being in recovery. You don't want to have to deal with the fact that being in recovery means failing, means falling down, picking up. So at this stage, this is the very early process of a person who is initially not even realising, but other people are realising that there's an illness. So for me, it was my mum getting phone calls from friends concerned. I'd trusted in one of my best friends at the time and told her that I'd been making myself sick because of the pressure I was under to eat when I was in my family environment, and she phoned and told my mum that. It caused a lot of confrontation, it caused conflict, it caused arguments, it meant me locking myself in my room so that I didn't have to deal with anything, and it caused a huge amount of stress on the family. Okay, but all I could focus on, I wasn't even convinced that my behaviours were helpful or important or saving me. I was so consumed and brainwashed that all I could think about was ways to get out of eating, and I fought everybody in my path who would try to care and try to feed me. And whenever somebody was showing care and concern, I hated them for it, because in my head they were stopping me doing what I wanted to do, and all that I cared about was weighing less than I was and going in that direction of continuing to lose weight until I felt better about myself. And at that point I genuinely thought that if I could just continue to keep myself empty and to not take food in, that everything was going to be okay. The thing with my eating disorder, which may differ from other people, I know we've touched on this, on how different people suffer with eating disorders, especially with regards to body image. My eating disorder didn't come from going on a diet and it going too far, or from me purposely restricting. What happened is I'd just come out of an abusive relationship, and also, and almost as a knee-jerk reaction to that, I became very socially isolated. I lost my appetite, which happens under periods of stress for me even now. And gradually, as my weight fell, and the less I ate because there was no interest in food, the harder it was then to eat foods. And then it'd be weeks and weeks since I'd eaten a certain type of food. And I can't, even to this day, I can't describe to you how and why that happened, because I guess if we knew the hows and whys to all of it, we'd have an actual, you know, well, on this channel we'd be worth millions, because we'd have a, you know, how to get better book that, you know, if everybody read would get better from an eating disorder. So for me at that point, my memories of that time were concerned with just distress constantly, because I didn't want to be in a situation where I had to eat. I would often go to other people's houses so that I wasn't at home, and lie to them and say, oh, I had to have lunch at home with my mum, so I didn't eat there either. And it was just this whole cycle of lying to people and just relief when I'd got away with something. So that's the kind of pre-contemplation. What came from that was a GP appointment and a very fast referral to an EDU service. But even at that point, I didn't understand what was going on, and there was, in my memory now and in hindsight, there was so much chaos in my head that all I wanted to do was distract from that. And all that happened when I went into treatment was that I started drinking and just using different ways of escaping, going out, you know, just getting so off my head that I didn't even know where I was or how to get home, or passing out in places. And that was how I coped with that constant pressure to try and get better. And I guess that the period that we're going to discuss next week of contemplation didn't really come until the first time I was put in hospital, whereby I'd had, you know, a number of months working with a clinical psychologist, and I'd become a lot more educated on my illness. And by that point of contemplation was when I was put in hospital, and I did have to weigh up the pros and cons, and it was all this, you know, how am I going to cope without my eating disorder? Is it worth the shot? And that's what I'm going to move on to next week. So for now, I've kind of discussed that initial process that a person might be. And what I do want to say is that yes, we might have been, there's a lot of people who might be watching these videos who've been in a process of recovery for a number of times. So what I'm kind of saying now might not actually relate to you, because although you may consciously be choosing to be in denial by continuing with your behaviours because you've had hospital treatment, you've done the rest of it, that's very, very different. That's very different. Like when I relapsed in 2007, I knew exactly what I was doing. I knew exactly what I was letting myself in for, but I continued anyway. This point for me, from what I understand it, is a point when people first realise they have an illness, and that can be an eating disorder, it can be depression, it can be bipolar, it can be any form of mental illness, that they start to hear that other people think that something's going on. And then we're going to move on to week 2, which is contemplation. So I just kind of wanted to get that in there, guys, and hopefully that will relate to some of you who are newly ill, if I can use that term, or have been ill for a long period of time but hasn't gained any insight into your illness. So even though you're at that pre-contemplation stage, it doesn't mean you can't move on to the contemplation stage. So I hope that's been of some help, and I will see you next week, guys. Okay, bye.